There you go. Hello. Thank you so much. This is a huge honor to actually get to spend the weekend with you. I've been completely blown away by everyone's enthusiasm and just like, I don't know, like how much excitement and energy there is around all of this. Like, it's kind of humbling because I spend a lot of time around like grunchy, like grouchy old, crusty programmers that I feel like I just want to bring them here and let them feel your energy for like 10 minutes and they can remember why they're doing what they're doing. But no, anyway, it's really awesome. And honestly, like just from the conversations I've had with a lot of you, I probably have as much to learn from you as you do from me. So hopefully at the end of this we can have a little bit more of a conversation, and then throughout the rest of the weekend I would actually love to talk more with you. Like I want to hear about the things that are working well for you, the things that you're struggling with, and the ways that GitHub can help. So, but right now I want to talk more about open source. Just to give you a little bit about who I am and what I do. So I'm at GitHub. I've been there about 4.5 years. I came in as an engineer, and then a few years ago started looking towards some of our open source efforts and thinking about how can we make it easier for people, communities and companies to embrace open source, and to just try and remove some of the barriers there. So one of the questions I've been asking a lot of people lately is how has open source impacted your career? And almost everybody that I talk to comes up with quote, something like this. I would not be a software engineer today if it weren't for open source. I believe my career opportunities have come from my contributions to open source, with my interests and skills being public. Or open source has expanded my network in a way that I could not have done on my own. So some of these people are people that most of these people are already successful in software development. So maybe this is a little bit of survivor bias. So there's probably a lot of people that maybe weren't as successful as these. But the theme over and over has been that getting involved in communities and participating in public has had a huge impact on the opportunities that were available to people and just the relationships that they've built. So like for example, another quote comes from Matthew Garrett, who's a Linux kernel hacker. I love the way that he phrases this. So without free software I'd have started years later. I'd have lost the opportunity to collaborate with people spread over the entire world. My first job would have looked very different, as would my entire career since then. Without free software, almost everything I've achieved in my adult life would have been impossible. So, this is really interesting stuff. Like, looking at my own career, like it has kind of followed the same path. So just to tell you a little bit about my backstory, how I ended up at GitHub. I went to school in 2001, which was just a few years ago, I think. Oh shoot, that was like 15 years ago now. I'm getting too old. I went to college in 2001 and I didn't know what I wanted to do, so I took a computer science class and I absolutely hated it. I was like, I do never want to be a computer programmer in my entire life. So I switched to music. Unfortunately, music classes were at 7:30 a.m. every day. So that didn't work out either. So halfway through the year I was like, okay, apparently college is just not for me. So I left, and through a bunch of like random chance and circumstance, met some right people and got hooked up with a job at the University of Nebraska at Omaha. And through several mentors there, was able to find open source software and started building amazing things. So I didn't come at it intending to find open source software. I came at it intending to find something interesting to do. And it just so happened that there was all these open source tools out there that allowed me to do that. So over the years, this theme kept coming up over and over, where I would look to do something interesting, find open source software that helped me do it, find people around those communities to help me be successful with it, and then as a result, end up participating more and have more opportunities. So that's basically what I want to talk more about today. So if you look at some of the latest research, basically open source talent is one of the top priorities for people hiring right now, and 87% of hiring managers say it's hard to find open source talent. So there are literally people who want to give you money and they cannot find you right now. Does anyone want more money or to get paid to do what you love in some form? Eventually? All right, okay, what the rest of you want if you don't want money and get paid? So today I'm going to talk about three of the aspects of contributing to open source that I have found incredibly helpful. contributing to gain experience, contributing to build a reputation, and contributing just to pay it forward. So the open source community and hackathons and everything around this whole ecosystem, there's tons of amazing opportunities to gain real world experience. Like, what other industry do we have the opportunity to go work with some of the smartest people in the field just because we connected with them on the internet? It's really interesting because if you start talking to those people, you realize that most of them are just like you. Most of them, they're either students, maybe they work at a small business or a startup, maybe they went to college, maybe they didn't, maybe they work for a large enterprise, maybe they're really smart and can do like low-level kernel hacking, maybe they're like me and they just learned JavaScript and how to make some things look nice on a web page. But all of them are normal people. The only difference is that they were able to take the skills that they had, build something interesting with it, and then make it available online so that other people could see it. So this is one of the things that was really hard for me to get over when I first started getting into this, was I thought that everybody else that was doing what I wanted to do were these amazing prodigies. Actually, tomorrow night I get the chance to go hang out with a good friend of mine in Boulder named Rick Olson, who works at GitHub. And Rick was one of those people, when I was getting into software development, I met him online and I thought he was just the most amazing person ever. A few years later, I got the chance to work with him at GitHub, and he is amazing. I'm not going to say he's not, but what I realized was he was just like me. Like, he was just trying to find something interesting to do, and he just happened to share what he was learning on the internet. So my first bit of advice to you is that it's okay to be new. Remember, all of these people are just like you. Everybody was new at one point. It might be intimidating, but it's fine. It's basically, as I was talking with a friend of mine, it's basically like high school all over again, right? Like, you walk in, you're a freshman, you have no idea what's going on. You feel like all the upperclassmen have this thing figured out. You make your first pull request and somebody shoves you into a locker. And then, like, you find out who your real friends are because they're the ones that come get you out. This is basically what working on the internet is like. But no, I thought that was a really interesting analogy, and it's so true. Like, think back to what your first experience was like in high school, the feeling of everything being new and it all being intimidating. And really, you just kind of have to take it a day at a time. Like, you sign up for classes, you start going, you start figuring it out, you find out who your friends are, who your people are, and halfway through the first year, you finally feel like you have it figured out. And then you actually realize you don't have it figured out, and this thing called imposter syndrome sets in. Is anyone familiar or heard this phrase? Does anyone feel like they experience it? Okay, more people experience it than have heard of it. That's really interesting. I don't get you guys. This is weird. No. So yeah, imposter syndrome is a really serious thing, and I think especially for those of us that see our idols on the internet and think that they're way more amazing than we are. I think there's some kind of phrase about how, like, we tend to compare our insides to other people's outsides, and I think that's really insightful. Like, I think about all the things that I do, and I'm like, oh, I struggle with this, and I can't do this. I'm not very good at, I'm not very good at public speaking. I'm not very good at coding. I'm not very good at my job. But I'm comparing all of my internal experience with the things that I see the collective group doing. So yeah, I mean, you're going to struggle with this. I don't actually have any good advice for how to get over it, but just to acknowledge that maybe you are not as good as you should be, but maybe you're not. Maybe you're just as good as everyone else, and that's okay. The point is that you keep trying and you get better over time. So the other thing with gaining experience around open source is remembering that open source is more than just code. So we just recently, I think this last week, published a blog post on the GitHub blog that looks at participation in open source projects based on number of contributors. So an open source project starts out, the big red chunk that's most of the space there is pushes or commits to code. And as you add more people to a project, the amount of activity that is code decreases and everything else starts to increase. So this is a really important point that even though, like, when we're talking about open source, we're talking about code, there's a lot more that goes into making a successful software project than just open source and code. It's all of the other things around it. So as you're thinking about trying to get into open source, think about the unique skills that you have. because here's all of the things basically that go into making these projects successful. So code is one part of them, design is another part, but there's also like advocacy components, so going out and giving talks about your favorite tools or your favorite languages, organizing events like hackathons, mentoring, helping other people overcome some of the hurdles. And then there's on the support side, community management, documentation, reporting issues. There's all kinds of things that you can do. So the important part is figure out what it is that you enjoy doing, what's the thing that you want to do, and then find a project that has those needs. And contribute, one of the easiest ways to start contributing to a project is to do something that you already know how to do on a new project. Get familiar with the community, and then you can start to expand your horizons into something new. As I was asking people the last few weeks about stories about how open source has impacted their life, one of them that I got was this guy that said, I got my first real web job because I learned a small open source CMS the agency happened to use. And I got my next big job due to my Drupal experience. And this is something we hear over and over and over again, that like people get exposed to open source, they start using something, and then that experience leads to the next big opportunity. So just keep in mind, like all of this experience that you're building up over time, some of it might not seem completely applicable right now, but all of that eventually is going to lead somewhere. So the second thing I want to talk about today is the building a reputation aspect of open source. So the first part is building experience and learning. Every day that you're learning something new, my question to you is, what do you have to show for that? What artifact do you have that shows that thing that you just learned? So like take a minute right now and think about the last thing that you learned. Was it a new programming language, a new tool, like a new trick, some life lesson? What evidence do you have to show that that's something that you learned? If somebody that wasn't sitting next to you, somebody that wasn't sitting next to you, how do they know that you know this thing now? So one of the biggest things I've learned about my career in general is that it's important to create public artifacts for the things that you're doing. So as you're gaining these experience, develop habits of leaving a trail. So maybe that's writing a blog post, maybe that's posting a tweet, maybe that's taking a picture of it and posting it on Facebook, maybe that's pushing your source code to GitHub. But start to form habits of sharing these things as you experience them. And basically start asking yourself, how can I create an artifact from this work? Does anyone know what this is? A few people? Does anybody love this thing? Does anybody despise this thing? Yeah. This is not me, I swear. I basically went to the trending page and found the person that had been active the most and took a picture of their profile. Now we all have imposter syndrome. So the great thing about this is that this naturally leaves a trail of the open source projects that we work on. The criticism of this, and a lot of people at GitHub have been thinking a lot about lately, is this only represents code. And like I said, there's a lot more to a successful software project than just changes to code. So it's something we're thinking a lot about. But in general, think about this with all of the tools that you use. Like, how are they leaving a trail of your experience? How will other people know what you've done? And so this might be things just like using Stack Overflow, helping answer questions, writing blog posts regularly on Medium, using Twitter. The whole point of all of this, though, is that your online persona is your resume. I love the MLH resume thing that's coming out. I think that will be really neat to have. But think about that in everything that you're doing, whether it's open source or hackathons or whatever. How are you leaving this trail? And then the last aspect of this with a little bit more imposter syndrome, the biggest barrier is to put everything I did, as imperfect or broken as it was, on GitHub. This is from Katrina Owen, who I work closely with at GitHub. This is a huge issue especially with people that are new, is getting over the fear of sharing what you did and putting it out there for people to judge. And there's not an easy answer to it besides once you've gotten there, help somebody else do it, because they're going to need some hand-holding just like you probably did. Which leads to the last thing I wanted to say, which a big part of open source is thinking about how you can pay it forward. Several of you, when Swift asked earlier how you got into hackathons, you got invited by a friend. And this is something that I think most of us take for granted. Like everything that, at least thinking about my life, all of the important things that I'm doing right now, all the important things that I love about my life, are things that somebody originally invited me into. It wasn't something that I just stumbled on my own or learned. And as I was preparing for this, I was asking a bunch of people about mentors in their life, and the interesting thing is that most of us say we have never had a mentor, and then we go on to list a bunch of friends that helped us. And so I think that we need to adjust kind of what our definition is of mentor. So now that you're more experienced in hackathons, or as you're getting more experienced in open source, start to think about ways that you can help teach. And this doesn't have to be completely selfless. Like one of the things I love about teaching is it actually helps you learn better. Several years ago when I was first getting into software development, one of the patterns that I started to establish was every Friday I would do this thing that I called Open Source Fridays, where I would reserve most of my day on Friday for thinking back on the week, thinking about the things that I'd learned, trying to either wrap them up into code and release them. So if it was, if I built a project, that added some little widget on a web page, I would say, how can I open source that? Or if I couldn't, how could I write a blog post that talks about what I learned building that thing? And then once I got to GitHub, for the first few years I fell out of the habit of that. I was too busy with work, too overwhelmed with day-to-day life. And so one day I decided I'm going to start doing this again. And so I posted on our internal team thing about my experience. I used to do this on Fridays. And right away our CEO chimed in. He's like, this is awesome. We should all be doing this. And so since then, for like last year and a half or so, we've had this thing that a lot of people around the company do called Open Source Friday. And some days it's more regular than not. But often it's taking time to step back and say, what have we learned this week? How can we share that with the world? How can we make our open source projects better? Or how can we just share knowledge that we've learned? So take time to step back and think about what you've learned and how you can teach that. And then the last thing I want to talk about with this is privilege. This is a topic that has been coming up a lot in the last few years. And all of us in this room have some degree of privilege, some more than others. Some of us let me speak for myself, I guess, because I think that's the only way you can do it when you're talking about privilege. So I was born into a middle-class family. I had a computer at age 13, 14, which was relatively unique for people in my situation. I never went hungry. I never lacked opportunity. My parents did everything they could to let me participate in the things that I wanted to do. I ran into the right people as I was growing up, had the right opportunities in front of me. And it would be really easy for me to say that I did this all on my own, but I think what we neglect is that this is basically the definition of privilege. Like we have all of these life experiences where things just happen to go our way. But what was happening was that there just wasn't roadblocks in the way. So if you're finding yourself in this situation, one of the biggest things that you can do is figure out ways to lend your privilege. And so this is, I think, a topic that's kind of hard to grasp sometimes. So if you think about it, think about opportunities that come your way. So maybe somebody asked you to give a talk, or somebody asked you to help organize an event. Who could you ask to do that with you or do it instead of you? Maybe somebody asked you if you wanted to just come to their event. Like, hey, we're doing this hackathon. Are you interested in coming? Say, yeah, sure. Let me grab my friend and see if they're interested in this opportunity. But anyway, like just keep this in mind. Everything that you're doing, think about ways that you can invite other people into this process, especially people that may not have that opportunity. So I just want to wrap up by thinking about like how all of this leads to some sort of successful career. I've been thinking a lot the last few years about what my own career goals are. And at time, if you would have asked me 10 years ago, it would have been like, oh, I want to make a ton of money and I want to build like the most successful project ever. And they all would have been really selfish. And as I've been thinking about the last few years, what's more important for me is that I do something meaningful. I'm lucky enough that I got to work at GitHub, and I think that that's pretty meaningful. I hope that I can continue to do more meaningful work there. I also care a lot about doing it with great people. I would rather have the worst job in the world and work with amazing people than have the best job in the world and work alone or work with people that I despise. And then I also want to earn enough to have basically a decent living. I don't need to make a ton of money, but I want to make enough just basically to be happy. So I think all of these things with open source have led to this. Basically by learning in public, by trying to build experience around open source software, by leaving a trail, leaving artifacts of the things that I've done, and then by trying to help lend privilege and pass it on to other people has led to this type of career. So, I mean, all this is basically just say, contributing to open source may not bring you fame or riches, but it will bring you experience, opportunity, and fulfillment. At least that's been my experience. So a few opportunities to point your way before we're wrapping up. John talked yesterday about the Campus Expert Program. This is one of those opportunities that would be really amazing, help you gain some of the skills we talked about, and help you also pass it on to other people. In terms of next steps, some things that you could do to coming out of this week. So basically just keep doing what you're doing. All of the hackathon stuff is amazing. The energy around it is absolutely contagious. Find a project to contribute to. Join Campus Experts, write blog posts, speak at a meetup, help friends do the same thing. So, thank you.
Hello, my name is Judah. I help organize HackYSU. I have a question. How do you feel about open source and like assignments for class where other people can cheat based on what you upload?
Do you want to answer?
I can answer this. So my opinion on that is, there's lots of different options. One common pattern I see in classes is, write a sorting algorithm, right? Like everybody in the class does the exact same thing. And I think the solution is to work on projects that are unique. So if you have a class and you can divide into groups and things like that, each group is working on their own project and they open source it, and you can't cheat because you're working on unique things, right? Like real world tools. So you can't always get around that, but that's generally like kind of what I say. And then I get a lot of requests from teachers to do like takedown. Like somebody posted their solutions on GitHub. Can't really do anything about that. So just follow your academic policies at your schools.
I also want to add the not education person perspective on this. This is from the person that dropped out of college. It's so weird to me that our education system is built around this idea that you shouldn't work together. And I realize the whole point is you want to teach people to do, you want people to learn how to write sorting algorithms, not that you should be regularly writing sorting algorithms. Because that's a horrible idea. That's the whole point of open source. You solve it once and then reuse it. But anyway, I think the challenge, like John was saying, find unique assignments, or I would love to see schools work more on finding projects where people work together. Where you bring together somebody that's a designer, somebody that's a coder, somebody that is a project manager, community manager, and figure out how to build something successful, because those are the type of people you'll be working with in the real world.
Hi, my name is Sahil. I'm from Texas A&M, and my question is, what are your favorite open source projects? And I'm not trying to say one's better than the other, but what are your favorite projects and what attracts you to them?
So recently, this is a really hard question. Recently, one that I was most impressed with was actually Swift. Shout out Swift. So Swift by Apple, I worked with them a little bit while they were releasing it, and I was really impressed at how intentional they were about bringing this project into the community as a real community project. That being said, they also come from a place of extreme privilege. They obviously have unlimited resources to do that. On the opposite end of the spectrum, a community-driven project. Actually, there's a really cool project written by a coworker of ours called Exorcism, exorcism.io. Yeah, really cool. It's basically learning coding exercises in each language, and it's absolutely fantastic. And there's been a huge community building around it. So there's a couple examples.
Can I say one?
Yeah.
All right, so it's a little bit selfish, but one of my favorite projects is actually one that I got to work with some students on. So last summer, we did Google Summer of Code, and we had a few students come work with GitHub, and we launched a project called GitHub Classroom. But the unique thing about it was it's an open source project, and it was actually totally written by students. So I was kind of like the project manager for that, and now this summer we have another like 5 students working on it. So it's a super fun thing to do. Go ahead.
So my question is kind of unrelated to the education aspect. It's more about the search function. Is that ever going to get like overhauled?
Please, yes. No, it's search has gotten a lot better. We work a lot with. So speaking of open source projects, we work a lot with the Elasticsearch project, and we are the largest Elasticsearch cluster, I think, by a factor of something, which is not necessarily a position you ever want to be in, but it's also really good because we get to help them like test edge cases and stuff like that. So yes, search is continually improving, and hopefully that will be more visible soon. Good question.
Okay. So a lot of us, when we're doing our summer internships, either have code that's proprietary or sign NDAs, so it never really gets to see the light of day. And you were talking a lot about leaving your mark. So then how do you do that with that sort of work?
Yeah, it's a really hard challenge. I think a lot of companies are finally getting to the point where their employee agreements and stuff are more reasonable. Like that's been a trend that's happening in the last few years. So like, I mean, even the largest companies in the world are realizing that they can't build successful products without open source participation. So that means that they need to allow their employees to engage in open source. For your specific case, I mean, that's just really hard. Like the answer is basically like you have to do it on your free time, which is exactly the opposite of the point of having an internship or something, you know, where you're getting paid to do this opportunity. So.
Yeah. Also, Brandon said like create public artifacts. That doesn't have to be just code. So I always recommend, you know, get approval if you can do it. But you know, if you can take screenshots, write a blog post, write things about the project. So maybe if you're not releasing the code, but you can write about your experience in your internship. So then when you want to show somebody you have a thing, it might not be the actual code, but you at least have, if that company, if the startup is closed or if they didn't deploy it, like if you worked on something, you have like proof that you did it, even if it's not the actual code.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Prince.
Hello, everyone. Prince from Night Hacks. My question really comes from campus experts and kind of what was the catalyst to actually providing that opportunity to students? Like, I know that this has been a more popular thing more recently about technical evangelism and developer evangelism. So what was the thought process behind bringing that to students, collegiate students?
Yeah, so it actually came out of this community. Last year at Hackcon, I was talking to a few people, and people were asking me about internships and about opportunities to represent GitHub and do things. And so it kind of just grew out of that. The real kind of motivation from our end is that we can't be everywhere, right? Like we get invited to all of these hackathons, and I can only go to one per weekend, and I do like my weekends, so I don't go every weekend. So instead of doing that, what I was thinking about is like, how can we help you, do that, right? So the idea was to just create a program where we can share our knowledge, give you opportunities, and then give you the resources you need to, kind of spread that knowledge. So that was the background on the program.
And it wouldn't be a talk without one more thing. Check your email. There is a link in there where you can get any t-shirt you want from the GitHub shop.